Week 46 of our 2020 Bible reading includes all of the book of Daniel. And so let's jump in and talk about everything in this book, or at least some of what is in the entirety of this book. As there is much to say, we won't waste a whole lot of time. Daniel, like Ezekiel that we read in the previous weeks, is living in Babylonian captivity. Daniel chapter 1, the prologue of the book of Daniel, explains how he and others were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon to be educated and to serve in the Babylonian court. So the stories and the visions recorded in the book of Daniel pertain to what happened to him and his friends during this exile, and the things that God revealed to him and that he wrote down while living really all of his life until he's a very old man in the courts of both Babylon and then Persia. And the theme of the entire book is this: God rules in the kingdoms of man. So if nothing else, have that in your mind as you read. But we'll notice a breakdown of the book that might highlight some things for us as well. And that is that the after the prologue, chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic. Now that may not mean much to you, but it's rare in the Old Testament because the Old Testament is primarily all the way through written in Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people, the Hebrews, right? But here in Daniel, we have a section written in Aramaic, which is a more common language that would have been spoken by all the peoples, the business language of the day, maybe much like English is today. So it would have been more universal. And so chapters 2 to 7 seem to be addressed to, or at least useful for, a wider audience. And you see in this 6th chapter section some symmetry in the stories that highlight what really the main points are supposed to be. In the second half of the book, we have these messages written in Hebrew again, so we switch back, that are primarily for God's own people. So in this first section, think about what we see as we go here. One of the huge messages is going to be this: that kingdoms of men are going to come, they're going to go, but God's kingdom is forever. And so in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue made up of different materials and the stone that crushes it and blows it all to dust, that's a picture, Daniel says, of the kingdoms that will come from Babylon on down, and then God's kingdom that will break in and will be established forever. And then the vision that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 7 of the beast coming up out of the sea, and then the Ancient of Days on the throne, the Son of Man that receives the kingdom. It's the same picture using different imagery. Another message of this section is that God delivers those who worship Him alone. And so the nations are trying to impose their will. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar wants everybody to bow down to the statue. Chapter 6, the men of Persia want Daniel to conform to their edict. But yet those like Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, those like Daniel that refuse and stay faithful to God, God's going to take care of them. And even the biggest, baddest threats of the nations won't touch them. And then finally, in the middle of all this, we see that God humbles prideful rulers. And as he says in chapter 4, sets over the kingdoms the lowliest of men. God's the one in control. And so those that are proud and arrogant will be humbled by God. Whether that's Nebuchadnezzar, who was sent out into the field to act like a beast, or whether that's his probably grandson, Belshazzar, who loses the kingdom because he's partying arrogantly on the night that the Persians are at the gates. Okay, so those are the messages for the peoples, for the nations, about God's rule. Now we come at the end of the book to focus back on, what about God's own? What about the Jews living in exile? And the first message that we'll highlight is that God hears the cries of His people in exile. Daniel in chapter 9 lifts up his voice for His people and says, "We have sinned, please hear us." And notice how strongly God says, and the angels really more so say in chapters 9 and 10, God hears you, and we're acting. God is moving heaven and earth, so to speak, to answer your prayer and to act on behalf of His people. And then, while confusing and difficult to understand, and for Daniel it's like terrifies him and knocks him out, and he's passing out, not understanding what he's seeing, the visions of chapters 11 and 12 are intended to say this: all these things are going to happen, and we're looking at the intertestamental period with much of what is being described. All these things are going to happen. God's people will suffer. God's people are going to be tried and tested, but God will work out the events to bring about their eternal salvation. And those that are righteous, because of the fulfillment of all these prophecies in the Messiah, God's people will be delivered from their temporary trial and granted eternal salvation, eternal life in God, in His Messiah. And that is what they can take comfort in. So, a lot in Daniel, and so we'll leave it at that, and then check back in next week as we get into the book of Ezra and beyond. Thank you so much.